You have never, not once in your entire life, regretted waiting before responding. You have, however, sent emails at 11 p.m. that you'd trade a kidney to unsend. That asymmetry is the whole book. There is a gap between what happens to you and what you do about it. Scientists call it the stimulus-response interval. Philosophers called it free will. Most people call it the 3 seconds before they said the thing that started a week of silence in their house. That gap is real. It exists in every human nervous system, including yours. The question isn't whether it's there. The question is whether you're using it, or whether you keep accidentally handing the controls to the part of your brain that was designed to fight predators and never quite got the memo about performance reviews. Here's what this book is not. It's not about becoming calm in a spa brochure sense. It's not about suppressing what you feel until you're fine on the outside and quietly furious on the inside. That's not emotional control. That's a pressure cooker with a painted-on smile. This is about something harder and more useful. It's about the gap, living in it, choosing from it, building a life from it rather than spending years cleaning up what happens when you don't use it. The psychology here is real. The neuroscience is real. And the patterns, the triggers, the spirals, the regrets, the promise to do better next time followed immediately by not doing better next time. Those are real too. Uncomfortably, specifically, recognizably real. By the end of this, you'll understand your own emotional architecture better than most people understand anything about themselves. You'll have tools that actually work under pressure, not just in theory. And you'll have, ideally, a slightly darker sense of humor about the whole situation, which helps. It genuinely helps. Because here's the thing about being human. We are large-brained, language-using, civilization-building creatures who still occasionally send a text in anger that we spend 3 days wishing we could retrieve. The gap between what we're capable of and what we actually do in heated moments is not a character flaw. It's a design condition. You didn't cause the design, but you're the one living inside it. So let's start there. Before we begin, if you're done waiting for motivation to find you, hit like. Not for me, for you. And subscribe only if you're serious about building the version you keep talking about. Chapter 1. The invoice. Your emotions have a billing department. You just never see the invoice until it's collections. Most people think emotional reactivity is a social problem. You lose your temper, someone gets upset, you apologize, life continues. Uncomfortable, sure, but manageable. What they don't account for is the compounding. The way each reaction doesn't just cost you that moment. It charges interest on every moment that follows. Think about the last time you had a bad interaction in the morning. Not a catastrophe. Just a sharp word. A defensive email. A conversation that ended with both people technically finished talking, but emotionally still going. Now trace that forward through the day. The meeting you were half present for. The decision you made too quickly because you were still carrying heat from earlier. The evening where someone asked how your day was, and you said fine in a tone that meant anything but. One reaction. One morning. And it billed you all day without asking permission. That's not a bad day. That's a pattern you've probably run hundreds of times. Here's the number nobody talks about because it's too uncomfortable to calculate. The cumulative cost of a lifetime of unconsidered reactions, in lost opportunities, damaged relationships, decisions made from emotion that logic would have handled differently, is staggering. Not metaphorically staggering. Financially, professionally, personally staggering. Executives have lost partnerships over emails written while angry. Relationships have ended not because of the crisis, but because of how someone handled the crisis. Careers have stalled not from lack of talent, but because someone couldn't be trusted to stay regulated under pressure. The word they use in performance reviews is emotional. They don't mean it as a compliment. The body, meanwhile, is keeping its own invoice. Cortisol, the hormone your system releases during emotional activation, doesn't disappear when the argument ends. It stays in circulation for hours, which means that one heated exchange at breakfast is biologically affecting your judgment at noon. You think you're over it. Your bloodstream disagrees. And here's the part that makes it worse. Every time you react without choosing to, you don't just pay the immediate cost. You train the system to be cheaper about it next time. Repeated emotional reactions physically reinforce the neural pathways that produce them. You're not just venting, you're practicing. You're getting better at reacting, faster, more automatic, lower threshold. Until eventually, things that wouldn't have bothered you 5 years ago now send you sideways in seconds. This is called the ratchet. It only turns one direction unless you deliberately intervene. The relational invoice is the one people feel most, but examine least. Every time you lose control with someone who matters to you, something happens that doesn't fully reverse. Researchers who study relationship dynamics call it trust erosion. They measure it in small withdrawals from an account that takes real time and real effort to replenish. You can apologize. You can mean it. And the apology matters. But the withdrawal already happened. Your children are watching how you handle the moments when handling it is hard. Your colleagues are quietly forming assessments of your reliability under pressure. Your partner is developing a running calculation, conscious or not, of how safe it feels to bring you the difficult things. None of this is fair, necessarily. But all of it is true. Here's the moment where the humor stops. You already know this. Some version of this, you already know. That's not the problem. The problem is the gap between knowing and changing, which is enormous and embarrassing, and shared by virtually every person who has ever tried to manage their own mind. Understanding the cost doesn't automatically reduce it. If it did, this would be a very short book, and you would have solved this years ago. What you need isn't more information about what reactivity costs. You need a different relationship with the moment itself. The 3 seconds before the invoice gets written, because the billing doesn't happen after the reaction. It happens in the moment you choose not to pause. The 3 seconds that keep charging you are not the problem. The problem is that most people have never actually practiced using them. There's a way out of this. It's not dramatic. It doesn't require a personality transplant or a meditation retreat or a different life. It requires building a skill, deliberately, consistently, imperfectly, until the pause becomes more available than the reaction. That's a trainable thing. The neuroscience is clear on this. The pathways that produce reactivity are not permanent. They're just well-worn. And here's what nobody mentions about well-worn paths. They feel like the only path because you've been walking them so long, you forgot there are others. The ledger isn't public. Nobody posts your emotional track record on a wall somewhere. But your relationships have been keeping it for years. The question isn't whether you'll start paying attention to it. The question is when. Chapter 2. The hardware problem. Your amygdala cannot tell the difference between a lion and a passive-aggressive email. Evolutionarily speaking, this was fine. Professionally speaking, it's a disaster. Let's start with the honest version of what's happening when you lose emotional control. You are not weak. You are not uniquely broken. You are not failing at some basic human competency that everyone else has quietly mastered. You are running hardware that is approximately 40,000 years old in conditions it was never designed for. This doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does explain it. An explanation is where change actually begins. Deep in your brain sits a structure called the amygdala. Small, almond-shaped, absurdly powerful for its size. Its job is one thing: detect threats and respond immediately. Not thoughtfully, not proportionally, immediately. Because in the environment your ancestors navigated, the cost of a false negative, missing a real threat, was death. The cost of a false positive, treating a harmless thing as dangerous, was just a few seconds of unnecessary adrenaline. Evolution made a reasonable call: over-calibrate toward danger, survive. The problem is that your amygdala is still making that call. Right now, in your office, at your dinner table, in your car. Every sharp comment, every perceived slight, every email with a tone that seems off. Your amygdala processes these with the same basic architecture it used to process predators. It cannot distinguish between a threat to your body and a threat to your ego. To the amygdala, embarrassment and physical danger produce similar signals. The sophistication of your social world has outpaced the sophistication of your threat detection system by roughly 40 millennia. This creates what researchers call amygdala hijack. And here's what makes it genuinely fascinating rather than just frustrating. It's fast. The amygdala processes threatening information in as little as 12 milliseconds. Your prefrontal cortex, the rational, planning, consequence-considering part of your brain, takes at minimum 500 milliseconds to process the same input. Do that math. By the time you're consciously aware of feeling angry, your body has already been in stress response for nearly half a second. Your heart rate is up, cortisol is releasing, muscles are tensing. The rational brain is arriving at the scene like a detective who got there after the witnesses already left. You are reacting before you can think. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal sequence of neurological events. And here's what makes it worse. The amygdala learns from experience, but it learns the wrong lessons with impressive reliability. Every time something triggers an emotional response, the amygdala files it under confirmed threat, which means the list of things that can hijack you doesn't stay stable. It expands, slowly, quietly, without your consent. Someone criticizes you at work once, and suddenly your amygdala is on alert for any tone that resembles that one. A relationship ends painfully, and your threat system starts flagging behaviors that are only vaguely similar to what hurt you before. You're not becoming more sensitive over time because you're weaker. You're becoming more sensitive because your alarm system is doing exactly what it was built to do. Get better at finding threats. It just doesn't realize the threats have changed. The modern world is, from your amygdala's perspective, absolutely insane. Hundreds of social interactions per day. Each one a potential source of rejection, humiliation, or conflict. Constant low-level stimulation from notifications, news, and the ambient pressure of other people's expectations. Your nervous system was calibrated for a quieter world, with clearer threats and longer recovery periods between them. Instead, it's running on 3 coffees, 4 hours of news, and a group chat that never stops. The result is a threat detection system operating in a state of chronic low-level activation, which means your threshold for full emotional hijack gets lower and lower over time. Minor inconveniences start producing major responses. You snap at the wrong person over the wrong thing, and even you can't fully explain why. It's because your system was already at 80% capacity before they said anything. Sleep deprivation makes this approximately 40% worse. That's not a figure I'm using for rhetorical effect. That's the number from the research. Sleep-deprived amygdala reactivity increases by roughly 40%. So if you're tired, reactive, and can't understand why everything feels like too much, you now have a neurological answer. You're not failing. You're running a high-performance system without doing the maintenance it requires. Here's the thing, though, and this is the part that actually matters. None of this means you're powerless. It means you've been trying to solve the wrong problem. You can't upgrade the amygdala. You can't rewire the speed of your threat response through willpower alone. But you can strengthen the prefrontal cortex. You can build the circuitry that catches the hijack earlier, that creates friction between stimulus and reaction, that makes the pause more available than it currently is. You are not losing control. You are running exactly as designed. That's the terrifying part. And also, if you think about it for a second, the useful part. Because designed systems can be worked with, understood, redirected. The software update is coming. The hardware shipped 40,000 years ago, but nobody said you couldn't learn to run it better. Chapter 3. The 4 floors. Most people have a complete philosophy about why their reactions are justified. Philosophers call this rationalization. The rest of us call it Tuesday. There is a 4-floor building inside every human being. Most people live on the first floor, have arranged the furniture nicely, and have largely stopped looking up. Let me describe what's on each floor. Not as an abstract model, as a mirror. Floor 1 is unconscious reactivity. This is where stimulus and response are essentially the same event. Something happens, and you respond, not as a choice, but as a reflex. Someone says something that bothers you, and you fire back before you've finished processing what they actually said. You feel anxious, and you avoid without examining whether avoidance serves you. You get excited, and you commit to something that your calmer self would have questioned. People on floor 1 don't experience themselves as reactive. They experience themselves as honest, direct, someone who doesn't play games or hide how they feel. And there's a version of that self-description that's admirable. The problem is when "I say what I feel" becomes a philosophy that protects you from ever having to examine what you feel before you say it. The tell for floor 1 is the language. You made me angry. I can't help how I feel. I was just being real. These are not expressions of authenticity. They are functionally disclaimers. A way of locating the cause of your behavior entirely in someone else's actions. Floor 2 is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because floor 2 is conscious reactivity. You know you're about to do the thing. You can see it coming, and you do it anyway. This is the floor where people send the text they knew they shouldn't send, where they say the thing in the meeting they knew would land badly, where they escalate the argument past the point of productive and keep going, aware in some background layer of their mind that this is going to cost them, and somehow unable to stop. I've been on floor 2, recently enough that I won't specify when. Floor 2 is worse than Floor 1 in one particular way. Floor 1 has the comfort of genuine unawareness. Floor 2 has awareness without traction. You watch yourself do the thing. You know better. You do it anyway. And then you have to carry both the consequence and the knowledge that you saw it coming. The cycle on Floor 2 is exhausting. React, regret, resolve to do better, react again. The resolve is genuine every time. The gap between resolving and actually changing is the problem. And that gap doesn't close through more resolve. It closes through building specific skills that Floor 2 residents typically haven't built yet. Floor 3 is where real change lives. This is conscious response. You feel the emotion, fully, clearly, and you choose your behavior separately from it. Not because you don't feel it, because you've learned that feeling something and acting on it are two distinct decisions, and only the second one is actually yours to make. People on Floor 3 understand something that sounds simple and takes years to actually internalize. Emotions are information, not instructions. Anger tells you something matters. It doesn't tell you to yell. Fear tells you there's uncertainty ahead. It doesn't tell you to retreat. The emotion is the signal. What you do with it is the choice. Getting to Floor 3 requires a specific skill. You have to be able to recognize your emotional state while you're in it. Not after. During. This is harder than it sounds because emotional activation literally impairs the self-monitoring capacity you need to do it. You're trying to use the system to observe the system while the system is compromised, which is why you need to build the skill during calm periods, not during the moments when you need it most. Floor 4 is what the psychological literature calls emotional alchemy. I describe it differently. Floor 4 is when the architecture changes, not just how you respond to emotions, but the underlying patterns that generate them, the interpretations, the default framings, the beliefs about what situations mean. When those shift, you don't just manage emotions differently, you start having different ones. Floor 4 is not a destination most people reach completely. It's more like a direction you keep moving in. Some situations you handle from Floor 4. Others catch you on Floor 1 at 7 a.m. before you've had coffee. The goal isn't to be permanently enlightened. The goal is to raise your average floor. Here's the thing that gets missed in almost every conversation about emotional development. Most people don't move between floors because they don't know the floors exist. They think they're either in control or they're not. They think some people are naturally calm and others naturally reactive, and that's just how the dice landed. This is one of the most expensive misconceptions in personal development. Emotional control is not a trait. It's a skill. Specifically, it's a set of skills, identifiable, trainable, measurable. Some people have a head start because of temperament or upbringing. But nobody arrives at Floor 3 without work, and nobody stays on Floor 4 without maintenance. The distance between floors isn't talent. It's reps. And the only floor you can start from is the one you're already standing on. Chapter 4. The pause mechanism. The single most powerful thing you can do when you want to say something devastating is absolutely nothing. For about 30 seconds. This is harder than it sounds and more effective than almost anything else available to you. Here is the problem with most advice about emotional control in the moment. It assumes that in the moment, you have access to your full cognitive capacity. It gives you frameworks to apply, questions to ask yourself, perspectives to consider, all of which require a functioning prefrontal cortex. And as you now understand, when you're emotionally activated, your prefrontal cortex is precisely what's been taken temporarily offline. You cannot access a complex strategy when you're hijacked. The strategy has to be simple enough to run on reduced capacity. 4 steps, 1 word each, something your brain can execute when your brain is not fully cooperating. This is the STOP method. And the name is almost too on the nose, except that it works. S. Stop. The moment you notice activation, you physically stop whatever you're doing. Hands off the keyboard. Mouth closed mid-sentence if necessary. Body still. This sounds almost insultingly simple. It is also something that most people in the moment do not do. The reason stopping works is neurological before it's behavioral. A deliberate physical halt sends a signal to your nervous system that you are not in a crisis requiring immediate action. It creates a tiny circuit break between the trigger and the habitual response. Not long, just long enough. The skill beneath the skill here is learning to read your own early warning system, because your body knows before your mind does. Heart rate climbing, jaw tightening, shallow breathing, heat in your face or chest, a strange stillness that's actually coiled tension. These are not random sensations. They are your nervous system communicating that activation has begun, that the amygdala has flagged something and the cortisol is starting to move. Most people miss these signals because they're not paying attention to their bodies. They're attending to the conversation, the screen, the other person's face. By the time they register that they're upset, they're already in full reaction. The signals were there 10 seconds earlier. They just weren't being read. Learning to catch the early signals is, in practical terms, worth more than any downstream strategy. Because everything is easier to manage at 60% activation than at 95%. The window for choosing is widest at the beginning. Take a breath. Not a regular breath. A specific pattern. Inhale through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Exhale through the mouth for 6. Repeat at minimum 3 times. This is called box breathing, and its effectiveness is not motivational. It's mechanical. The extended exhale activates the vagus nerve, the primary pathway of your parasympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for calming the stress response. You are not trying to feel calmer through willpower. You are directly stimulating the biological mechanism that produces calm. The reason this works faster than thought-based strategies is that it bypasses the cognitive layer entirely. You don't have to believe it will work. You don't have to feel differently first. The breathing pattern changes your physiological state, and your emotional state follows. Body first, mind second. Always. Navy SEALs use this. Surgeons use this. Not because they read a book about it, because it works when nothing else does. Give it more time than feels comfortable. The instinct when you're activated is to rush through the breathing and get back to dealing with whatever triggered you. Resist that. The goal isn't to calm down enough to function. It's to calm down enough to think. Those are not the same threshold. Oh, observe. Now that you've interrupted the physical cascade, you can do something you genuinely could not do 30 seconds ago. You can look at what's actually happening, as distinct from what your nervous system decided was happening in the first 12 milliseconds. This step has 2 targets, external and internal. Externally, what actually happened. Not what it meant, not what it implies about the other person's motives or your relationship or the trajectory of this situation. What happened, stated as plain fact. Someone said a specific thing, A specific event occurred. A message arrived with a specific content. That's all that's verifiable. Everything else is interpretation. Most emotional reactions are not responses to facts. They're responses to interpretations of facts. Which means if you can separate the two, even briefly, you often find that the fact is considerably less threatening than the story you built around it in the first half second. Internally, what are you actually feeling, and where is it sitting in your body? Name it as precisely as you can. Not upset, angry, embarrassed, afraid, disappointed, hurt. The precision matters neurologically. Specific emotional labeling reduces amygdala activity in measurable ways. You are not just naming the feeling for your own understanding. You are literally using language to down-regulate your threat system. Observe without judgment. This is not the moment for self-criticism. You're a scientist briefly, not a judge. What is present? What triggered it? What story am I telling about this? Is that story the only possible story? P. Proceed. Not immediately, deliberately. Proceeding doesn't mean responding right away. It means making a conscious choice about what happens next, based on your values and your actual goals, not on the emotional pressure that was running you 30 seconds ago. Sometimes the proceed step is a considered response to the situation. Sometimes it's deciding you need more information before you can respond well. Sometimes it's recognizing that you're still too activated to respond from your best self, and that waiting an hour or a day will produce a better outcome for everyone involved. Sometimes it's realizing the situation doesn't require a response at all. Each of those is a choice. That's the point. You're choosing from a position of at least partial clarity, rather than having the choice made for you by your nervous system's ancient priority system. The stop method becomes more natural with practice. At first, you'll remember it after you've already reacted. That's fine. That's still useful. It builds awareness of your own patterns. Then you'll catch it mid-reaction, then earlier. Eventually, you'll catch it at the signal stage, before the hijack completes. Here's the thing that every regret you've ever had about a reaction has in common. You had enough time to pause. The pause was available. You just didn't take it. That's not a moral failure. That's a skill gap. And skill gaps close. The pause isn't weakness. It's the only move that has never, in the history of its use, made anything worse. Chapter 5. The stories you're defending. When you're furious, you are always arguing for a story. The story might be true, but it might also be a narrative you've been polishing for 30 years and simply applied to this situation because it fit well enough. This is the chapter that will make you slightly uncomfortable. Not because the ideas are difficult, because they're accurate. And accuracy about this particular thing, the stories we defend as though they're facts, has a way of landing in the chest before the mind. Here's the mechanism. Something happens. In the first fraction of a second, before you've consciously processed the event, your brain does something remarkable and deeply problematic. It generates an interpretation, not tentatively, not as a hypothesis, as a conclusion. The interpretation arrives feeling like perception, like you're simply seeing what's there. Like anyone paying attention would see the same thing. They would not. Two people in the same conversation can come away with completely different understandings of what was communicated, what was meant, what the other person's motivations were, and what the interaction reveals about the relationship. Both people will experience their interpretation as obvious. Neither will initially recognize it as an interpretation at all. This is not a flaw in how humans process information. It's a feature. Your brain is a prediction machine, and it generates meaning fast, because fast meaning-making kept your ancestors alive. The problem is that fast meaning-making is not the same as accurate meaning-making. Speed and precision are different things, and your brain optimized hard for one of them. So when your colleague doesn't acknowledge your idea in the meeting, your brain doesn't present you with a list of possible explanations ranked by probability. It presents you with one interpretation, delivered with the confidence of fact. They dismissed you. They don't respect your contribution. They're threatened by you, or they don't value you, or this is consistent with the pattern you've been noticing for months. That interpretation might be correct. It also might be that they were distracted by something unrelated to you, or they didn't hear you clearly, or they were formulating their own thought and missed the moment. You don't know. But the emotion you're now carrying doesn't know that it's responding to a hypothesis. It responds as though the interpretation is settled truth. And here's where it gets more interesting. The interpretation your brain generates is not random. It's shaped by your history, by every similar situation you've experienced, every conclusion you've drawn about how people behave, every wound that left a template for recognizing danger. Your past is constantly editing your present. The person across from you is not just themselves, they're also every person who reminded your nervous system of a time when something hurt. Which means some significant portion of what you're defending when you feel certain about an interpretation is not this situation at all. It's an older one. You've been carrying the verdict from a different trial and applying it here because the surface features matched well enough to trigger the pattern. This is not weakness. This is how associative memory works. But it does mean that when you feel most certain you're seeing clearly, you should be most curious about whether you are. The tool for this is cognitive reframing, and I want to be precise about what that means, because it gets misrepresented constantly. Reframing is not positive thinking. It's not telling yourself that everything is fine when it isn't. It's not forcing optimism onto a situation that genuinely requires concern. Reframing is the deliberate practice of generating alternative interpretations for events. Not to make yourself feel better, but to make your response more accurate. Because if your initial interpretation might be wrong, then the emotion that interpretation produced might be misfiring. And the behavior that emotion is pushing you toward might be solving for the wrong problem. Here's how it works in practice. When you notice a strong emotional reaction, before you act on it, generate 3 alternative explanations for whatever triggered it. One that's more charitable than your initial read. One that's neutral, explaining the behavior without assigning any particular intent. One that's actually worse than your first interpretation, if you can manage it. The worst-case one might surprise you. Most people find that when they're genuinely forced to articulate the darkest possible interpretation, it sounds more paranoid than they're comfortable owning, which creates useful distance from the milder version they were treating as fact. The charitable interpretation is not the point either. The point is the exercise itself. When you force yourself to generate multiple explanations, you've done something your brain was not going to do automatically. You've cracked open the certainty. You've introduced a question mark where your nervous system had placed a period. That question mark is where your power lives. There's a specific application of this that's worth spending time on, because it comes up constantly in the contexts where emotional reactions do the most damage. It's the interpretation of silence. Silence. No response to a message, no acknowledgement of a contribution, a conversation that ends without resolution, is the most aggressively interpreted signal in human communication. Precisely because it contains no actual information, the brain fills it entirely with projection. And what it projects is almost always unflattering to the person who isn't there to defend themselves. The unanswered text becomes evidence of disrespect. The colleague who went quiet after your proposal becomes someone who's working against you. The friend who didn't reach out becomes someone who doesn't care. None of these conclusions are available in the actual data. The actual data is nothing happened. The story is entirely yours. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of what upsets you is correct as fact and completely wrong as conclusion. Something did happen. The event was real, but the meaning you assigned to it, the part you're actually responding to, the part driving the emotion and the impulse to act, that part is a construction. Yours. Built from your history, your fears, your patterns, and defended often with everything you have. Because the stories aren't just explanations, they're identity. To question the interpretation is to question the self that generated it, which is why people resist reframing even when they can intellectually see that it would serve them. It doesn't feel like updating a hypothesis. It feels like conceding something, like backing down, like admitting that the certainty you felt was something other than perception. It was. And that's not an indictment. It's just how the system works. The frame is always there. You're always holding one. The only question is whether you know you're holding it. Because the moment you know, you get to choose whether to keep it or look for one that's closer to the truth. You get to choose the frame. You just rarely realize you're holding one. Chapter 6. Naming the animal. I'm upset is the emotional equivalent of a doctor saying something's wrong with your body. Technically accurate, completely useless. Language is not decoration for emotional experience. Language is infrastructure. The words you use to describe what you're feeling don't just label the state. They shape it, narrow it, make it workable, or leave it unmanageable. And most people are navigating their entire emotional lives with a vocabulary of about 6 words. Happy, sad, angry, anxious, fine, stressed. This is the emotional equivalent of describing every temperature as either hot or cold. Technically, you're not wrong, but you're losing so much information in the compression that the description is nearly useless for actual decision-making. Consider the difference between frustration and disappointment. Both feel bad. Both involve something not going the way you wanted. But frustration is about a block. Something is in the way, and the energy wants to push through. Disappointment is about a gap. Something you expected or hoped for didn't arrive. The appropriate responses to these two states are entirely different. Frustration calls for problem-solving, strategy, persistence, or creative redirection. Disappointment calls for grieving something, adjusting expectations, or reconnecting with what you actually value. If you call both of them upset, you'll apply the wrong response half the time. You'll push against something that needed acceptance, or accept something that needed pushing against. Precision matters. Not for elegance, for function. Consider the difference between anxiety and excitement. Physiologically, these two states are nearly identical. Elevated heart rate, heightened alertness, a sense of something approaching. Your body cannot reliably distinguish between them. Your mind makes the call based on the label you apply. Research by Alison Wood Brooks at Harvard found that people who reframed pre-performance anxiety as excitement, just the word, just the reframe, performed measurably better than those who tried to calm down. The state was the same. The label changed what the state did. Or consider anger and hurt. Most people who express anger are also experiencing hurt. But anger is easier to express. It faces outward and has force. Hurt is vulnerable. It requires acknowledging that something mattered enough to wound you. When you go into a conversation leading with anger, because that's what you named and that's what you deployed, you often get defensiveness and escalation. When you lead with hurt, you get something closer to connection. Because hurt is recognizable to the other person. It's hard to fight someone who's showing you they're injured. But you can only lead with hurt if you've accurately identified it. If you've called it anger because that felt safer, you'll behave accordingly and get the anger results. Here's the neuroscience, because it's unusually satisfying. When you accurately label an emotion, you activate your prefrontal cortex, specifically the areas associated with language and conscious processing. This activation is not neutral. It simultaneously reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain regions responsible for rational thought, and the brain regions responsible for emotional alarm are, in a meaningful sense, in competition. When you name what you're feeling precisely, you are literally using language to shift resources away from the threat response. Researchers call this affect labeling. It sounds like a bureaucratic term for something that should be profound, but the effect is real, reproducible, and significant. You are not just describing your emotional state when you name it accurately. You are changing it. The naming is an intervention, not just an observation. The implications of this are larger than most people realize. If labeling reduces emotional intensity, then vague labeling, I feel bad, I'm stressed, I'm just off today, does the opposite. It leaves the amygdala without a clear target. The threat system stays activated because nothing has been clearly identified and processed. The fog of vague negative feeling is, neurologically, more destabilizing than a clearly identified, difficult emotion. This is why rumination is so exhausting. Rumination is not emotional processing. It's repetitive exposure to an undefined threat without the resolution that naming provides. You're running the alarm system in a loop without ever locating what triggered it. Now, building an emotional vocabulary is not a complicated project. It is a slightly uncomfortable one, because precision about what you're feeling requires honesty about what you're feeling. And there are states that most people would rather keep vague. Envy is one. Most people call it frustration, or unfairness, or a general sense that something is wrong with how things are distributed. Envy, I want what that person has, is harder to say. It feels small, petty, beneath the person you'd like to be. But if you can't name it, you can't examine it. And unexamined envy is one of the more reliable drivers of bad decisions, particularly the kind that damage other people under the cover of principle. Shame is another. People call it embarrassment, self-consciousness, anxiety. Shame is different. Shame says, I am the problem, not just my behavior. It's a state that requires specific handling, very different from guilt, which locates the problem in an action and therefore has a path toward repair. Shame locates the problem in the self and tends to produce either collapse or aggression, depending on the person. If you call shame by a softer name, you'll apply the softer name remedies and find that they don't work. I'll be direct here. Most people avoid naming their emotions precisely because precision reveals what they'd rather not see. The vagueness is protective. If it's just stress, it doesn't have to be examined. If it's fear that I'm not actually as capable as I've been presenting, then you have to sit with that for a minute. Sitting with that for a minute, it turns out, is exactly what moves you forward. The practice is simple. Several times a day, during low-stakes moments, not crises, pause and name what you're feeling as specifically as you can. Not to change it immediately, just to see it clearly. Notice whether there's an easier name you're reaching for, and whether that name is actually accurate, or whether it's just more comfortable. The more precise your map, the better you can navigate. And you cannot navigate territory you've deliberately left unlabeled. You can't argue with a feeling you haven't named, and you can't outrun one either. Chapter 7. The body keeps score, and it votes first. You cannot think your way out of a physiological state. This is not a motivational failure. It is a biological fact. This chapter is about the relationship between your body and your emotions. Specifically, the direction of that relationship, which is almost exactly backwards from what most people assume. The common model goes like this. Something happens. You have an emotional response, and your body reflects that response. You get scared, and your heart races. You get angry, and your muscles tense. The emotion is the cause. The physical state is the effect. This model is wrong, or rather, it's incomplete in a way that matters enormously for how you actually change your emotional experience. The more accurate model, supported by a significant body of research including the work of neuroscientist Antonio Damasio and psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett, goes like this. Your brain is constantly monitoring your body's state. Heart rate, muscle tension, breathing pattern, gut activity, hormonal environment. It is using this physical data continuously, automatically, to generate your emotional experience. The body is not downstream of the emotion. The body is upstream. The body is one of the primary inputs the brain uses to decide what you're feeling. This has a consequence that is either frustrating or liberating, depending on how you look at it. If you're in a physiological state of threat activation, heart rate elevated, muscles tense, breathing shallow, cortisol circulating, your brain will generate emotional experiences consistent with that state. It will find or manufacture reasons to feel what your body is already broadcasting. And if you try to change that emotional experience purely through thought, through reasoning yourself into a different feeling, through telling yourself it's fine, through positive self-talk, you're working against the current. You're arguing with the upstream signal. The effective approach goes the other direction. Change the physical state first. The emotional state follows. This is why breathing works. Not because it's calming in some vague sense, because the breathing pattern directly changes your physiological state, which directly changes the data your brain is using to generate your emotional experience. You're not convincing yourself to feel different. You're giving your brain a different body to work with. The same logic applies to several other somatic, body-based regulation tools, each of which works through a specific physiological mechanism. Progressive muscle relaxation. The technique involves systematically tensing and releasing muscle groups, working from the feet upward through the body. Each cycle of tension and release does something specific. It processes the physical energy that accumulates during emotional activation. When you're stressed or threatened, your body prepares for action. Muscles contract. Energy mobilizes. If that mobilization never gets discharged, if the threat response activates but no physical action follows, the energy stays in the system. It continues to signal threat to the brain. Tension without release keeps the alarm running. Deliberately tensing and releasing each muscle group gives that energy somewhere to go. It's not metaphorical discharge. It's literal. The nervous system registers the tension, the release, and the new state of relative relaxation, and updates its broadcast accordingly. Cold exposure is the one that gets the most skeptical reactions, which is ironic given that it has among the most direct physiological mechanisms. When you expose yourself to cold, a cold shower, cold water on the face and wrists, deliberate immersion, your body activates the dive reflex. Heart rate drops. Blood flow redirects. The parasympathetic nervous system engages. This happens automatically, within seconds, with no cooperation required from your conscious mind. The cold doesn't care about your emotional state. It produces a physiological response regardless. And that physiological response, the activation of the parasympathetic system, the drop in heart rate, the biochemical shift, changes what your brain has to work with. The emotional experience shifts as a consequence. Elite performers across wildly different fields have used cold exposure not as a wellness trend, but as a regulation tool. Because it works fast, it's reliable, and it requires nothing from the part of the system that's currently compromised. Movement deserves more credit than it receives in emotional regulation conversations, where it's usually mentioned as a long-term strategy. Exercise regularly and you'll feel better. True, but not immediately useful when you're activated right now. What's more immediately useful is this. When your body is in a threat state, it has prepared itself for physical action. The stress hormones, the muscle tension, the elevated heart rate, these are preparation for movement. If you move, even briefly and vigorously, you're giving the preparation its intended outlet. The system completes its cycle and can return to baseline. Even 5 minutes of vigorous movement during or after an emotionally activating event materially changes the physiological state. Not because exercise is good for you in the abstract, because you're giving the stress response the physical resolution it was biologically designed to have. Here's where this gets most important and most overlooked. Most emotional regulation advice starts and ends with the mind. Notice your thoughts. Challenge your interpretations. Choose a different story. All of that is useful. Genuinely useful, as we've covered. But it's working on the downstream end of the system. And if the upstream, the body, is still broadcasting threat, the downstream work is fighting a current it can't overcome. The practical implication is sequencing. When you're activated, the order matters. Body first, then mind. Regulate the physiology before you try to reason with the cognition. Use breath, movement, temperature, muscle release, whichever is available to you, to change the physical state. And then, from that different physical state, apply the cognitive tools. Trying to do it in the other order is not impossible, but it's the hard way. It's arguing with the input rather than changing it. There's a broader principle underneath all of this that's worth naming directly. Most people relate to their bodies as transportation for their heads. The body is the thing that carries the brain around, needs feeding and maintenance, occasionally causes problems. The mind is where the real work happens. This is not just philosophically suspect, it's practically counterproductive. Because the body is not a passive vessel. It's an active participant in your emotional life, and it's been voting first on every emotional question you've ever faced. The mind believes it's in charge. The body has been running this operation the whole time. Start working with it instead of around it. You'll find that the emotional states you've been trying to think your way out of become considerably more manageable when you approach them through the system that generates them. You don't calm your mind and then relax your body. It goes the other direction. It always has. Chapter 8. Building the floor. You cannot access sophisticated emotional regulation strategies when you slept 5 hours, skipped breakfast, and drank your third coffee before 9 a.m. This is not judgment. This is physics. There is a version of emotional mastery that gets discussed almost exclusively in terms of in-the-moment techniques. The pause, the breath, the reframe, the label, and those things matter. They're real tools with real effects, but there's a foundational layer beneath all of them that determines how available those tools are when you actually need them. And most people never talk about it because it's less interesting than techniques. It's less dramatic than breakthroughs. It's mostly just Tuesday. It's your baseline. Your baseline is the physiological and psychological state you're operating from before anything happens. Before the difficult conversation, before the frustrating email, before the situation that tests you. It's the floor your emotional regulation stands on. And here's the thing about floors. They determine how high you can build. A weak floor doesn't just limit the structure. It makes the structure unreliable. It makes everything built on top of it contingent and fragile. When your baseline is strong, you have genuine access to your emotional regulation tools. You can pause. You can breathe. You can notice the story and question it. You have, in the language of the researchers who study this, regulatory capacity. The actual cognitive and neurological resources required to choose your response rather than simply execute your reflex. When your baseline is compromised, sleep-deprived, undernourished, sedentary, chronically stressed, socially isolated, your regulatory capacity shrinks, not slightly, dramatically. The tools are still theoretically there. But the system that would use them is running on reserves it doesn't have. This is why the same person can handle a difficult interaction with grace on a good day and completely fall apart over something minor on a bad one. It's not inconsistency of character, it's fluctuation of capacity. And capacity is determined, more than most people are comfortable admitting, by the basics. Sleep is first, not because it's the most interesting variable, but because it has the largest effect size of anything on this list. The amygdala, your threat detection system, becomes roughly 40% more reactive when you're sleep-deprived. The prefrontal cortex, the rational, regulating, pause and choose part of your brain, becomes less active and less connected to the amygdala at the same time. So you get a more sensitive alarm system with a weaker override mechanism simultaneously. This is, to use the clinical term, a bad combination. The research on this is not subtle. People who sleep fewer than 7 hours per night show measurably impaired emotional regulation, increased reactivity to negative stimuli, reduced capacity for empathy, and worse performance on every cognitive task that requires executive function. Those are not small effects. They're the kind of effects that, if produced by a drug, would dominate headlines. Sleep quality matters alongside quantity. A bedroom that's dark, genuinely dark, not just dim. Cool, not comfortable, cool. Quiet or as close to it as you can manage. No screens in the hour before sleep, because the blue light disrupts melatonin production and the cognitive engagement keeps the prefrontal cortex activated when it needs to be powering down. Consistent timing, the same sleep and wake time across the week, including weekends, within a 30-minute window. Your circadian rhythm is a biological system. It works best with regularity and degrades with variability. None of this is new information. The reason it belongs in a book about emotional mastery is that most people treat sleep as optional, the variable that gets cut when everything else needs more time. But sleep is not optional for the system that produces emotional control. You cannot save time by sleeping less and then regulate your way through the consequences. You're borrowing against a credit line that charges compound interest. Nutrition is second, and it operates through a mechanism that's more direct than most people expect. Your brain runs on glucose, not exclusively, but primarily. And when your blood glucose is unstable, spiking and crashing in response to processed foods, skipped meals, excessive caffeine, alcohol, your emotional regulation capacity fluctuates with it. The irritability that arrives mid-afternoon in people who've eaten poorly is not a personality feature. It's biochemistry. The brain, experiencing reduced glucose availability, shifts toward conservation mode. Complex cognitive functions, which include emotional regulation, get deprioritized relative to basic functions. You become more reactive and less capable of the deliberate response selection that Floor 3 requires. The practical intervention is not complex. Protein with every meal stabilizes blood sugar more effectively than any other dietary variable. Omega-3 fatty acids, found in fatty fish, walnuts, flaxseed, support the structural integrity of the neural membranes that your brain uses to communicate between regions. Hydration matters more than most people account for. Even mild dehydration produces measurable cognitive impairment. And inflammatory foods, the category that includes most processed foods, excessive refined sugar, and alcohol, impair brain function through mechanisms that are increasingly well documented. You are not separate from what you eat in the way people like to believe. The brain is a physical organ. It has a physical environment. That environment is determined significantly by what you put into your body. Treating nutrition as unrelated to emotional regulation is like treating the oil level in an engine as unrelated to how the engine runs. Movement is third, and it's the variable with perhaps the most underappreciated effect on emotional baseline. Regular exercise increases production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, a protein that supports the growth and maintenance of neural connections, including in the prefrontal cortex. It increases serotonin and dopamine availability. It reduces baseline cortisol levels, and it provides something more immediately relevant to emotional regulation, controlled stress. When you exercise at significant intensity, you are deliberately putting your body under stress and choosing to stay in it, to keep going, to not exit the discomfort. This is, structurally, not metaphorically, the same thing you do when you feel an emotional reaction and choose not to act on it immediately. You're experiencing an uncomfortable state and exercising the choice to stay regulated through it. That capacity is trainable, and exercise is one of the most direct ways to train it. Not because the physical stress and the emotional stress are the same thing, because they engage the same regulatory systems. The prefrontal cortex, the override mechanism, gets stronger through use. Physical endurance training and emotional endurance training are, at the neurological level, partially overlapping. The fourth pillar of baseline is meaning. This is the one that sounds the most abstract and operates through the most concrete mechanism. People who have a clear sense of purpose, who can connect their daily activities to something they genuinely care about, something larger than immediate comfort or short-term reward, show consistently stronger emotional resilience across every measure the research uses. They tolerate adversity longer. They recover from setbacks faster. They make better decisions under pressure. The mechanism is not motivational in the sentimental sense. It's attentional. When you know why something matters, you're less likely to be derailed by the friction of the process. The difficult moment is contextualized. It's still difficult, but it's difficult in service of something, which changes its relationship to your emotional regulation system. Meaningless difficulty depletes. Meaningful difficulty builds. You don't need a grand mission. You need genuine connection to something you actually care about. That could be your work, your relationships, your craft, your community, your growth. The content matters less than the authenticity of the connection. A borrowed purpose, one you've adopted because it sounds right or because others expect it of you, won't provide the same regulatory scaffolding as one that's genuinely yours. The fifth pillar is what gets called strategic stress exposure. The logic is identical to physical training. You don't build cardiovascular capacity by resting. You build it by putting the system under load, recovering, and loading it again. Emotional regulation capacity works the same way. If you only practice emotional control in comfortable situations, you will only have access to it in comfortable situations. Deliberate, chosen exposure to uncomfortable situations, difficult conversations, challenging projects, activities that require you to stay regulated under pressure, builds the capacity you'll need when the uncomfortable situations aren't chosen. Cold exposure again, public speaking, difficult conversations you've been avoiding, physical endurance challenges. Each of these is stress that you enter voluntarily, which means you maintain agency throughout. Voluntary stress, managed and recovered from, builds the system. Involuntary chronic stress depletes it. The distinction is control. Here is the principle underneath all of this. The techniques in this book are tools. Tools require a functioning hand to hold them. When your baseline is compromised, the hand isn't functioning properly. You might know exactly what you should do in a difficult moment and find that you simply cannot access it, not because the knowledge isn't there, but because the system that would execute the knowledge is running on empty. Building your emotional baseline is not self-care in the popular sense of the word, which has been diluted to mean almost anything pleasant. It is infrastructure maintenance for the system that determines how you show up in every situation that matters. The capacity to stay calm under pressure isn't built during pressure. It's built on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing's at stake. Chapter 9. Turning the heat into fuel. Every negative emotion you've ever had was trying to tell you something. You were usually too busy suffering from it to listen. This is the chapter where we stop treating your emotional life as a problem to be solved and start treating it as information to be read. It's a significant shift. Most of the content you've encountered on emotional regulation, including most of this book so far, has been about managing difficult emotions, controlling their effects, preventing them from running your behavior. That's necessary work. But it's only half the equation. The other half is this. Negative emotions contain energy. real, significant, redirectable energy. And that energy, when it's suppressed or vented without direction, is wasted. Worse than wasted, it usually costs you something on its way out. The goal was never to feel less. The goal is to feel smarter. Let's start with anger, because anger is the most misunderstood emotion in the entire catalog, and the one that people most consistently handle at the two worst extremes. They either detonate it, say the thing, send the message, make the face, deliver the verdict, or they compress it, pack it down, present a surface of calm while the thing continues burning underneath until it finds a different exit, usually one they didn't choose and can't control. Both of these approaches waste the most useful thing anger contains, which is energy and direction. Anger is, at its core, your psyche's response to a perceived violation. Something that matters to you is being threatened, dismissed, ignored, or damaged. The anger is not the problem. The anger is the signal. It is a flag planted in your emotional landscape that says, "This matters to me. Right here. This thing." The intensity of the anger is roughly proportional to how much it matters, which means anger, read correctly, is a precision instrument for identifying your values. The situations that make you most angry are reliably the situations most connected to what you care most about. The injustice that enrages you is almost always adjacent to something you believe strongly. The dismissal that infuriates you is almost always about something you're genuinely invested in. Instead of directing the anger at the person or situation that triggered it, which produces conflict without resolution, the transformation process redirects the energy toward the underlying value. What does this anger tell me matters to me? How do I want to act in defense of that thing? What would be a meaningful response that honors the signal rather than just venting the pressure? Some of the most consequential human achievements have been built on transformed anger. Not suppressed anger, which calcifies into bitterness. Not expressed anger, which damages and depletes. Transformed anger, the kind that asks what it's pointing at, and then moves in that direction with intention. Fear is the second major currency of negative emotion, and it gets perhaps the worst reputation in self-development contexts. The dominant message from every motivational framework you've ever encountered is that fear is the enemy, the thing between you and your best life, the obstacle. Eliminate it, overcome it, act despite it. This is partly right and mostly incomplete. Fear is not the obstacle. Fear is the compass. Here's what fear is reliably doing when you feel it, pointing at something that matters. You don't fear losing things you don't care about. You don't fear failing at things that are unimportant to you. The presence of fear in relation to a goal or a decision is almost always evidence that the goal or decision is genuinely significant, that it connects to something real in you. The fear is not warning you away. It's telling you that you're near something that matters. The practical implication is counterintuitive, but consistent. When you feel afraid of something that isn't physically dangerous, that fear is one of the better signals available that you should probably move toward it, not away from it. The things that frighten you are the things your nervous system has registered as high stakes. High stakes means high value. The path toward your most meaningful work, relationships, and growth is almost always marked by fear somewhere along it. What courage actually is, not in the motivational poster sense, but in the functional, operational sense, is taking the information from the fear signal and acting anyway, not in the absence of fear, alongside it. The fear doesn't have to disappear for you to move. You just have to stop treating it as a stop sign when it's actually closer to an arrow. Frustration is next, and it's the one most people are sitting with most of the time without realizing it. Frustration has a specific structure. It requires a gap, something you want and something in the way. The energy of frustration is directional. It's pointed at the obstacle, and it's significant. People who are frustrated are not apathetic. Apathy doesn't produce frustration. Caring produces frustration. Frustration is what caring looks like when it's being blocked. The transformation here is from blocked energy to redirected energy. Instead of expending the frustration on the obstacle, complaining about it, resenting it, being demoralized by it, the question is what the obstacle is revealing. Persistent frustration with the same category of situation is almost always a diagnostic signal. The system is trying to solve a new problem with an old strategy. The frustration is the error message. It's telling you that the current approach isn't working, not that the goal is wrong. People who learn to read frustration this way become unusually good at adaptation. They don't take the feedback personally. They take it practically. What's not working? What might work differently? The frustration becomes the fuel for figuring out the better approach, rather than the evidence that the better approach doesn't exist. Sadness is the emotion people are most universally poorly equipped to handle, and the one that, when avoided, creates the most secondary problems. Most people treat sadness as purely loss. Something is gone. Something didn't happen. Something ended. And the response is to exit the state as quickly as possible, distract, suppress, reframe into something more palatable, move forward, stay busy. This exits the state without processing it. And sadness that isn't processed doesn't go away. It relocates. It becomes a baseline flatness, or a sensitivity to minor losses disproportionate to their actual significance, or a vague resistance to caring about things because caring led to this. Sadness is, underneath the pain, a clarifying experience. It tells you what you value by showing you what hurts to lose. The things that generate genuine grief are, almost without exception, the things that genuinely mattered. And sitting with that, not indulging it endlessly, not performatively dwelling, but actually feeling the full weight of what the sadness is pointing at, produces a kind of clarity that nothing else does. What do I actually care about? What actually matters to me, stripped of the noise and the performance and the things I thought I was supposed to value? Sadness, if you stay with it long enough to hear what it's saying, will tell you. Shame is the last one I want to address specifically, because it's the most complex and the most frequently mislabeled. Shame is different from guilt in one critical structural way. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am something bad. Guilt is about behavior. Shame is about identity. This distinction matters enormously because they have completely different implications for what to do next. Guilt has a natural path forward. Acknowledge the action. Understand the impact. Make repair where possible. Adjust the behavior. The sequence is available, and the resolution is achievable. Shame has no natural path forward because the problem it identifies, you, yourself, isn't fixable in the way a behavior is fixable. Which is why shame produces either collapse or aggression. Either a withdrawal from the situation, I'm not enough, I shouldn't be here, or an attack on whatever or whoever is activating the feeling. Because if I can invalidate the source, I can temporarily escape the verdict. The transformation of shame requires the same precision we discussed with emotional labeling. You have to correctly identify it first. Not call it stress or embarrassment or anxiety. See it for what it is, and then separate the behavior from the identity. The action that generated the shame is not evidence of permanent character. It's information about a specific choice, a specific moment, a specific gap between your values and your behavior. That gap is closable, but only if you're looking at a gap, not at a verdict. The question isn't how to make this feeling go away. It's what this feeling is trying to tell you. It's how to use the energy, the heat, the pressure, the force, in a direction that actually moves you towards something rather than just burning you where you stand. The question isn't how to feel less, it's how to feel smarter. Chapter 10. Confidence isn't a feeling. Confidence is not something you feel before doing hard things. It is something you accumulate by having already done them. Nobody tells you this. They just tell you to believe in yourself, which is genuinely not useful advice. Let's be precise about what confidence actually is, because the word has been used so loosely and so enthusiastically in popular culture that it's become almost meaningless. Confidence, as it's usually described, a feeling of certainty, a sense of readiness, an absence of self-doubt, is not a reliable foundation for anything. Because feelings are fluctuating states. They respond to sleep quality, blood sugar, recent feedback, social context, and approximately 40 other variables that have nothing to do with your actual capabilities. Basing your willingness to act on how confident you feel is basing your decisions on meteorology. The weather changes. You need something more structural. Real confidence is not a feeling. It's a body of evidence. Specifically, it's the accumulated record of situations you've faced and gotten through, including ones where you performed badly, handled things imperfectly, failed outright, and recovered anyway. That record doesn't fluctuate with your mood. It exists. It's real. And the more extensive it is, the more genuine the confidence it produces. This is why emotional mastery is the foundation of real confidence rather than a separate skill set. Because emotional mastery is precisely the capacity to face difficult situations and remain functional. To not collapse under pressure, to not retreat from discomfort, to show up, handle what needs handling, and survive the things that feel unsurvivable. Every time you do that, even imperfectly, you add to the record. The record is the confidence. Here's the part that most people have backwards. They believe confidence is a prerequisite for taking action. They're waiting to feel ready before they do the hard thing, have the difficult conversation, pursue the goal that frightens them. They're treating confidence as a condition that must be met before action becomes safe. But confidence doesn't precede action. It follows it. The sequence is always: act despite uncertainty, survive the experience, update your assessment of your capability, repeat with slightly larger challenges. Confidence is the output of that loop. It cannot be injected at the beginning. It's produced at the end. Which means the people waiting to feel confident before acting are waiting for something that cannot arrive until after they've done the thing they're waiting to feel confident about. This is a closed loop with no entry point. It feels like caution. It functions like a trap. Waiting to feel ready is a form of procrastination with excellent PR. The first pillar of real confidence is emotional self-reliance. This is the knowledge, not the belief, the knowledge based on evidence, that your emotional state is not permanently dependent on external conditions, that you can navigate difficult internal states without collapsing, that when something hard happens, you have the capacity to process it and continue. This knowledge is built through one process only: going through hard things and noticing that you came out the other side, not necessarily intact, not always gracefully, but functional, still moving. The discovery that you are more resilient than your worst moments made you feel has to be made through experience. It cannot be told to you in a way that sticks. Every time you use the pause when you wanted to react, you're building emotional self-reliance. Every time you sit with a difficult feeling instead of immediately escaping it, you're building it. Every time you stay regulated under pressure when your previous pattern would have been to fall apart, you're building it. These are not dramatic moments. They're ordinary ones. The confidence they produce is structural and quiet rather than loud and performed. The second pillar is competence. Real competence, not perceived competence. The feeling that you're doing well, but the actual development of skills that produce value. The relationship between emotional mastery and skill development is more direct than it appears. Most skill development is blocked not by lack of talent or opportunity, but by the emotional experiences that accompany the learning process. Learning requires being wrong. Being wrong produces discomfort. Most people respond to that discomfort by exiting the learning situation, physically, by stopping, or psychologically, by defending against the feedback rather than receiving it. Emotional regulation is what makes sustained skill development possible. The person who can tolerate being a beginner, who can receive criticism without becoming defensive, who can fail without treating failure as a verdict, that person accumulates skill at a rate that emotionally fragile people simply cannot match. Not because they're more talented, because they can stay in the room longer. When you can regulate your emotional response to imperfection and failure, you gain access to the full information that failure contains. Failure is the highest density feedback available. But you can only extract its information if you're not busy defending yourself against its implications. This is the competitive advantage that nobody advertises, because it sounds unglamorous. The person who can handle being wrong gracefully will, over time, become considerably more right than the person who can't. The third pillar is integrity alignment. This is the consistency between what you say you value and how you actually behave. When these match, something happens internally that's difficult to describe, but unmistakable when you experience it. A kind of solidity, an absence of the background noise of self-betrayal. You know you're living from the real thing rather than performing a version of it. When they don't match, when you compromise your stated values through small decisions that seem insignificant individually, the opposite happens. A subtle erosion, a growing uncertainty about your own reliability. You stop trusting yourself, not because you've failed at something external, but because you've noticed that you can't fully count on yourself to do what you say matters to you. This matters enormously for confidence, because genuine confidence requires self-trust. You cannot be confident in your behavior if you've demonstrated to yourself that your behavior is negotiable under pressure. Every time you honor a commitment to yourself when it's inconvenient, you're making a deposit into the account that self-trust draws from. Every time you don't, you're making a withdrawal. The accumulation of those transactions is your actual relationship with yourself, and that relationship is the bedrock of everything else. The fourth pillar is resilience as evidence. This is distinct from the first pillar. Emotional self-reliance is about knowing you can navigate internal states. Resilience as evidence is about having the external record, the actual situations you've faced and survived, that demonstrates this to you concretely. People who avoid adversity, who consistently choose the comfortable option, who optimize for safety over growth, deprive themselves of this evidence. They remain theoretically capable and practically unproven. This creates a particular kind of fragility. Everything feels high stakes because nothing has been tested. When nothing has been tested, every test feels potentially catastrophic. The deliberate seeking of manageable challenges, not recklessness, not suffering for its own sake, but consistent exposure to situations slightly beyond your current comfort, builds the record that genuine confidence requires. You know you can handle pressure because you've handled pressure, not because you've been told you can, not because you've visualized yourself doing it, because you have actually done it and you remember. The fifth pillar is what I'll call forward identity. This is operating from who you're becoming rather than who you currently are. Not in a delusional sense, not pretending to capabilities you don't have, but in the sense of making decisions from your values and your direction, rather than from your current limitations. Most people make decisions that are consistent with their current self-concept, which means their decisions perpetuate their current self-concept, which means they don't grow. The loop is self-sealing. Breaking the loop requires occasionally acting from a slightly more expanded version of yourself, asking not what you currently feel capable of, but what the person you're working to become would do in this situation, and then doing that thing, imperfectly, with the uncertainty intact, and updating your self-concept based on what you discover. The final pillar is contribution focus. When your attention is on what you can give to a situation rather than how you're being evaluated in it, something remarkable happens to the self-conscious anxiety that undermines confidence. It simply has less to work with. Most confidence problems are attention problems. The attention is on the self, how you look, what people think, whether you're measuring up. And that self-focused attention generates the anxiety that feels like lack of confidence. Shifting the focus outward. What does this situation need? What can I contribute? How can I be useful? Removes the conditions that anxiety requires to operate. This is not selflessness in the sentimental sense. It's strategic reorientation of attention. And it works because it's pointing at something real. You actually do have something to contribute. The confident version of you isn't a better evaluator of your own worthiness. It's just someone whose attention is elsewhere. You don't build confidence by winning. You build it by not collapsing when you don't. Chapter 11. The closest people get the worst version. You can manage your reactions with your boss, your clients, your acquaintances, and strangers on the internet with admirable consistency. And then your partner says one specific thing, and you are suddenly a completely different person. This is not hypocrisy. It's not weakness. It's a feature of how intimacy works that nobody fully prepares you for, and understanding it is the difference between endlessly apologizing for your worst self and actually changing the conditions that produce it. Here's the mechanism. Emotional regulation requires resources, cognitive resources, physiological resources, the attentional capacity to notice what's happening and choose a response rather than execute a reflex. These resources are finite. They deplete across the day. Every interaction where you're managing your presentation, every meeting where you're professional, every social situation where you're appropriate, every moment where you're performing the regulated version of yourself, draws from the same account. By the time you get home, the account is low. And the people at home are the ones you've decided, at some deep and largely unconscious level, you don't have to perform for. Which means they get the unperformed version. The one without the management. The one that runs on whatever's left. This is intimacy's paradox. The people closest to you, the people you love most, the relationships you would identify as most important. They receive the least regulated version of you precisely because they're important enough that you stopped performing. The safety of being known creates the conditions for your worst behavior. You're not meaner to them. You're just less filtered. And the filter was doing more work than you realized. The people closest to you are not triggering your worst self. They're revealing it. This is important because the corrective approach changes depending on which of those is true. If they were triggering it, you'd manage the trigger. But if they're revealing it, if what you're seeing in your intimate relationships is the unmanaged baseline, then the work is on the baseline itself, not on the specific situations that expose it. The first principle of emotional mastery in relationships is understanding what you're actually responsible for, which is exactly 50% of the interaction. Not the dynamic, not the outcome, not the other person's behavior or emotional state or the choices they make about how to engage. You're 50%. Your response to what they do, your contribution to the tone, your role in either escalating or de-escalating what's happening. Most people spend enormous energy on the other person's 50%. They analyze it, narrate it, build cases about it, bring historical evidence to bear on it. This is both exhausting and strategically pointless, because the other person's 50% is not available to you as a variable. You cannot directly change it. You can only change what you do with it. And here's the unexpected truth about that. When you consistently manage your 50%, when you become the person in the interaction who is choosing rather than reacting, you indirectly influence their 50% in ways that trying to directly manage it never could. Your regulated behavior changes the emotional environment of the interaction. It removes the escalation fuel. It creates a different set of conditions for them to respond to. You cannot control whether other people are calm. You can control whether you add to the heat or reduce it. Those are not the same thing, but the second one does more to produce the first than anything else available to you. The second principle is understanding the specific dynamics of conflict escalation in intimate relationships, because most people are running a pattern they've never examined. Here's the typical sequence. Something happens. A comment, a tone, a behavior, something that connects to an existing sensitivity. One person responds with mild activation. The other person, picking up the activation through the emotional contagion we discussed earlier, activates in response. The first person, now receiving heightened energy back, escalates. The second matches or exceeds it. Within minutes, the conversation has traveled far from its origin, and both people are arguing about things that have nothing to do with whatever started it. This pattern has a name in the research: demand withdrawal, or its various cousins. The specific content varies by couple, by family, by relationship structure. But the architecture is consistent. Someone reaches, someone retreats or counterattacks. Both people feel increasingly unheard, and the emotional temperature rises in proportion to how unheard they feel. The pattern sustains itself because each person is responding to the other's behavior in ways that make sense given what they're feeling. And yet, the sum of two rational responses is an irrational spiral. This is systems thinking applied to relationships. Individual moves that seem logical produce collective dynamics that serve no one. Breaking this pattern unilaterally from your 50% is the most powerful thing available to you in a relationship conflict. Because the pattern requires both people's participation. Remove one participant from the escalation loop, and the loop cannot sustain itself. The specific tool for this is conscious de-escalation, not conflict avoidance. Those are different things. Conflict avoidance is not engaging with the difficult thing. De-escalation is engaging with it while deliberately reducing the emotional temperature of the engagement. Practically, when the other person raises their voice, you lower yours. Not passive-aggressively, genuinely, as a regulatory choice. When they become certain and declarative, you become curious. When they close off, you open up, not to capitulate, but to create space. When they accuse, you reflect back what you heard before you respond. This is counterintuitive because it goes directly against the mirroring instinct. When someone escalates, your nervous system wants to match or exceed their energy. That's the threat response doing its job. Your job is to override it deliberately, because matching their escalation solves nothing and costs you both. The third principle is separating the person from the behavior. This is easier to understand than to practice, because intimate relationships are precisely the contexts where the two are hardest to separate. When someone you've known for years does something frustrating, the frustration doesn't arrive as "they did a specific thing that I found difficult." It arrives as "there they are again, being that way." The history compresses into the moment. The pattern activates the feeling as much as the specific behavior does. You're not just responding to what happened today. You're responding to everything it rhymes with. The separation requires a deliberate cognitive step. What specifically happened right now, in this moment? Not the pattern, not the history, not the evidence it might be adding to a longer case. The specific thing. Because the specific thing is almost always smaller and more manageable than the accumulated story. This doesn't mean ignoring patterns. Patterns in relationships are real and important information. But addressing the pattern requires a different kind of conversation than responding to a specific moment. And conflating the two produces neither. You end up in a conversation that's too big and too charged to resolve anything, where both people feel they're being tried for crimes beyond what they remember committing. The most effective conversations about patterns are ones that happen outside the activation, when everyone is calm, when neither person is defending themselves, when both people can engage with the pattern as a shared problem rather than a prosecution, which requires someone to wait for that moment rather than bringing the conversation into the heat, which requires the pause, which is always, ultimately, where the power lives. The fourth principle addresses something that sounds technical, but lands very personally when you really look at it. It's called emotional Aikido. The martial art of Aikido works by redirecting an attacker's energy rather than meeting it with opposing force. You're not trying to stop the incoming force. You're using it, redirecting it, letting its own momentum become part of the solution. In relationships, this looks like receiving someone's anger or frustration without absorbing it as a personal indictment. When someone is upset and directing that at you, your habitual response is almost certainly either defense, "I didn't do that. That's not fair, you're wrong," or counterattack, "Well, you always do this." Both responses treat the emotional energy as an argument to be won. Aikido treats it as energy to be redirected. Redirecting sounds like, "I can hear that you're frustrated. Tell me more about what this feels like from your side." Or simply, "That landed hard. I'm listening." These are not capitulations. They're not agreements. They're acknowledgments of the emotional reality, which is the only thing the other person actually needs before they can hear anything from you. When people feel heard, the temperature drops, not because the problem is solved, because the emotional need underneath the conflict, to be recognized, to matter, to have their experience acknowledged, has been partially met. And a partially met emotional need is considerably more receptive to problem solving than a completely unmet one. The fifth principle is the hardest one to hold, especially in long-term relationships where old wounds are deep and old patterns are well-grooved. It's this: being the calm one is not losing. There is a version of relationship conflict that's organized around fairness. Who reacted worse? Who started it? Who owes the apology? Who gave up more ground? This accounting is understandable. The desire for acknowledgement, for the other person to see how their behavior affects you, is legitimate. But organizing your behavior around this accounting means matching their escalation when they escalate, defending when they attack, and withdrawing when they withdraw. Because you're not going to be the one who backs down when they're the one who started it. This is a dignity calculation masquerading as a strategy, and it loses every time, because two people optimizing for not being the one who backs down produces a standoff that resolves nothing. Someone has to be willing to be the calm one. Someone has to be willing to step out of the mirror dynamic first. That person is usually the one who's done more work on their own emotional regulation. Not because they're more wrong, because they're more capable. Being capable of choosing your response in a moment that pulls hard toward reaction is not losing. It's the only version of winning in a relationship that doesn't cost you something you actually value. Because the goal of a relationship conflict is not to win the conflict. It's to preserve and strengthen the relationship while resolving the specific issue. Those goals require different behavior than the accounting system produces. Being the calm one isn't losing. It's the only version of winning that doesn't cost you something. Chapter 12. The long game. Nobody's life fell apart because of one reaction. It fell apart because of the pattern. And nobody's life transformed because of one pause. It transformed because of 10,000 of them. This is the chapter that requires the longest time horizon to fully appreciate, which is precisely why most people don't appreciate it. Human cognition is biased toward the immediate. We register the cost of the next hour more vividly than the cost of the next decade. We feel the discomfort of the pause more acutely than the accumulated benefit of 10,000 pauses. We see the single argument we didn't have, and we don't see the slowly compounding interest of a life lived with greater emotional choice. Compound interest is the most powerful financial concept in existence. Apply it to behavior, and it becomes the most powerful personal development concept. Small, consistent inputs, over time, produce outputs that seem disproportionate to the individual deposits. The math doesn't look impressive day by day. It looks extraordinary decade by decade. Emotional mastery is compound interest applied to your life. The first compound effect is relational trust, and it builds more slowly and more durably than almost any other thing we've discussed. Trust in relationships is not produced by grand gestures. It's produced by consistency, by the accumulated evidence, built over hundreds and thousands of small moments, that you can be counted on to be a certain kind of person under pressure. That when things get difficult, you don't become someone else. That your regulated behavior isn't a performance that drops when the stakes get high. It's actually who you are. Every time you stay calm when someone expects you to lose it, you're making a deposit. Every time you listen when your instinct is to defend, you're making a deposit. Every time you choose the long-term health of the relationship over the short-term satisfaction of being right, deposit. These are individually imperceptible. Cumulatively, they produce something that no single action could. The relationships in your life that feel most solid, where you can bring the difficult things, where there's repair available after conflict, where vulnerability doesn't feel dangerous. Those relationships are built on exactly this kind of accumulated evidence. Someone, at some point, stayed regulated enough times that the trust became structural. It became the foundation rather than something being negotiated in each interaction. The inverse is also true, and starker. Relationships that feel chronically unstable, where trust is thin and anxiety is high, are almost always built on a history of inconsistency. Not necessarily major betrayals, often just a long record of moments where the person could have been calm and wasn't, could have listened and didn't, could have chosen connection and chose being right instead. The small withdrawals add up exactly the same way the deposits do, just in the other direction. The second compound effect is your reputation, and it operates on a timeline most people significantly underestimate. Reputation is not what people say about you. It's the expectation they bring to every interaction with you. A set of predictions about how you'll behave under different conditions, built from all the data points they've accumulated about you over time. Your emotional patterns are among the most salient inputs into that prediction model. The person who consistently demonstrates emotional regulation under pressure becomes known as someone who can be trusted with difficult things. They get included in sensitive conversations. They're sought out during crises. They're given responsibilities that require someone who won't make a hard situation harder. This is not a formal process. Nobody convenes a meeting to decide you're trustworthy. It happens through the slow accumulation of data points in the minds of everyone around you. The compound logic here is that reputation creates opportunity, and opportunity creates development, and development creates better performance, which creates stronger reputation. The loop is self-reinforcing, but it only starts turning through consistency over time. One good interaction doesn't establish a pattern. 20 does, 100 does, 1,000 definitely does. The third compound effect is decision quality, and this one has perhaps the largest impact on life outcomes because it touches everything. Every domain of your life is shaped by the quality of your decisions. Career trajectory, financial position, relationship choices, how you spend your time, what you pursue, and what you walk away from. These decisions are made, to a degree most people don't fully account for, under emotional conditions that significantly affect their quality. Decisions made from anxiety tend to optimize for safety over growth. Decisions made from anger tend to optimize for punishment over resolution. Decisions made from excitement tend to underestimate risk. Decisions made from fear tend to contract when expansion would serve better. The emotional state you're in when you decide shapes the decision in ways you can measure, but rarely attribute correctly. The person who develops consistent emotional regulation doesn't make perfect decisions, but they make decisions from a wider, cleaner range of information. They can engage with risk without being controlled by fear of it. They can recognize genuine excitement without being swept away by it. They can receive bad news about a situation without the bad news becoming the entire frame. Over a lifetime, those differences in decision quality compound into dramatically different life outcomes. Two people with similar starting points, similar intelligence, similar opportunities. The one with better emotional regulation makes marginally better decisions across every domain, consistently, for decades. Margin times consistency. Times time equals a gap that eventually looks like a different life. The fourth compound effect is health, and this one is biological rather than behavioral, which makes it both more concrete and more sobering. Chronic emotional reactivity produces chronic stress. Chronic stress produces chronically elevated cortisol, and chronically elevated cortisol does things to the body that are neither subtle nor reversible in the short term. It impairs immune function. It accelerates cellular aging, measurably, through telomere shortening, which researchers can now directly observe. It increases inflammatory markers associated with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cognitive decline, and a range of other conditions that become relevant in the second half of life. The health literature on this is not ambiguous. The psychological and the physical are not separate systems with separate concerns. Your emotional life is producing biological conditions that determine, in significant part, how long you live and how healthy those years are. The compound version of this is that every year of lower chronic stress is a year of reduced biological wear. Every decade of better emotional regulation is potentially years added to a healthy lifespan. The research suggests this is not a small effect. The gap in health outcomes between chronically stressed and emotionally regulated people over a lifetime is substantial. This doesn't mean emotional difficulty makes you sick. It means that the chronic, repetitive physiological state produced by unmanaged emotional reactivity, the sustained cortisol, the sustained inflammation, the sustained sympathetic nervous system activation, has cumulative biological costs that compound over time exactly like interest does. The fifth compound effect is learning acceleration. This one is subtler but real. When your emotional regulation is strong, you have access to the full informational content of your experiences, including, especially, the difficult ones. Failure is information. Criticism is information. Conflict is information. Setbacks, disappointments, things that didn't work the way you planned. All of it is information that can be used to update your approach and improve your performance. But information requires reception to be useful, and emotional reactivity blocks reception. When you're defensive, you're not receiving feedback. You're managing the threat of it. When you're devastated by failure, you're not extracting its lessons. You're surviving it. The emotional state that the difficult experience produces determines whether you leave the experience smarter or just more bruised. The person with strong emotional regulation leaves difficult experiences with information they can use. The person without it leaves with wounds they have to recover from. Both had the same experience. Only one of them learned from it. Over time, that difference in learning rate compounds into a difference in capability that has nothing to do with native intelligence or talent. The sixth compound effect is the quality of your inner life. This is the one that sounds the least impressive in a list of outcomes and is in practice the most important. There is a version of success that looks correct from the outside, The accomplishments, the relationships, the reputation, the health, where the person living it is chronically at war with their own mind. Where the baseline internal state is tense, reactive, defended. Where quiet is not peaceful, but just the absence of current threat. Where the inner narrator is running a constant commentary that is rarely kind. This is not a good life to live, regardless of its external measurements, and it is the natural end state of unmanaged emotional reactivity taken to its conclusion. Not dramatic suffering, just a kind of grinding, low-grade difficulty that colors every experience, that makes the good things harder to feel fully and the bad things heavier than they need to be. The person who develops emotional mastery over time moves toward a different inner climate. Not one without difficulty or negative emotion, one where those things move through rather than accumulate, where the baseline is calm enough that genuine pleasure is available, where the inner narrator gradually becomes less adversarial. This is worth working toward not for what it produces externally, but for what it feels like internally. The daily texture of your experience is your life, not the highlights, not the achievements. The ordinary Tuesday at 2 p.m., and what it feels like to be inside your own mind then. Here's the final thing, the one worth sitting with. You are not choosing, in any given moment, simply how to react. You are choosing, through the accumulation of those moments, who to become. The person who pauses becomes, over time, a person who pauses. The person who chooses becomes, over time, a person who chooses. The neural pathways that get used get stronger. The ones that don't get used get quieter. You are slowly and continuously building the person who will live the rest of your life. That person is being built right now. In the next difficult conversation, in the next moment where reaction is easy and choice is hard, in the next 3 seconds before you do the thing, you'll either be glad you did or sorry you didn't. The version of you who paused, who chose, who didn't ruin it, that person is available right now. They've been waiting in the gap. Conclusion. You have never, not once in your entire life, regretted waiting before responding. We started there. We end there. Not because it's a tidy callback, but because it's the whole thing, compressed. Everything in the preceding chapters, the neuroscience, the tools, the frameworks, the compound effects, is in service of that one asymmetry. Waiting costs you almost nothing. Not waiting has cost you things you can't always get back. The gap is real. It has always been real. 3 seconds, sometimes less, between what happens to you and what you do about it. That gap is not a luxury available only to people with perfect childhoods or exceptional temperaments or the right circumstances. It's structural. It's in every human nervous system, including yours, including on the worst days, including under the most pressure you've ever faced. You've just been moving through it too fast to notice it was there. Here's what's true about everything you've read. None of it works as information. It only works as practice. The pause doesn't help you if you understand it, but never use it. The emotional labeling doesn't change your amygdala reactivity if you think about it intellectually, but never actually do it in the moment. The somatic tools, the reframes, the 4 floors, the baseline pillars, they're all inert until they're practiced, repeated, made into something the body knows rather than just the mind. This is both the frustrating part and the relieving part. Frustrating because there is no shortcut. You cannot read your way to emotional mastery. You have to earn it through repetition in real conditions, with real stakes, when it's genuinely hard. The knowledge accelerates the process. It doesn't replace it. Relieving because it means you don't have to be ready. You don't have to have it figured out. You don't have to wait until you're the kind of person who does this well before you start doing it badly. Starting badly is the process. Catching yourself after you've already reacted and using that awareness to catch yourself slightly earlier next time. That is the practice. There is no cleaner version of the beginning. I'll tell you the one thing I've found most useful across everything I know about this subject. It's not a technique. It's a question. A single question that, if asked honestly in difficult moments, does more work than most frameworks combined. What kind of person do I want to be right now? Not in the abstract, not as a general aspiration. Right now, in this specific moment, with this specific person, in this specific situation, what kind of person do I want to be? The question cuts through the noise of the emotion, the justifications, the very compelling argument that your reaction is warranted and the other person deserves it, and this situation is genuinely an exception. It locates you in your own values rather than in the heat of the moment. And here's the thing about that question. You always know the answer. Even when you don't act on it, you know. That knowing is the gap. That gap is the power. The work is never finished. This is not a project with a completion date. The person who spent 30 years building reactive patterns does not undo them in a month of mindful breathing. The neural architecture changes slowly, through repetition, through the patient and imperfect accumulation of better choices over worse ones. There will be regressions. There will be weeks where you handle everything with grace, and then one Tuesday where someone says exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment, and you respond in a way that would embarrass the version of you that read this book. That Tuesday is not evidence of failure. That Tuesday is evidence of being human, which remains non-negotiable. What changes with practice is the recovery time, the self-awareness that arrives, how quickly you can see what happened, understand why, and return to the person you're building rather than staying in the person you're trying to leave behind. The distance between the reaction and the recognition shrinks, and then the reaction itself gets smaller. And then sometimes, not always, not perfectly, but sometimes, the pause happens first. That's the whole thing. That's what you're building toward. Not a life without emotional difficulty, a life where the difficulty moves through you rather than accumulating. Where the hard moments don't define your behavior so much as they reveal your training. Where the 3 seconds between what happens and what you do about it are long enough to contain a choice. The gap has always been there. You're just learning to live in it.